Hello my friends, how are you? This video is a continuation of the previous video about 10 men were subjected to horrific executions in the middle of the 17th century in an unbelievable way. If you want to watch the previous video, I will leave you the link in the description. 5. Mithridates, 401 BC. Being eaten alive, scaphism, the worst punishments in human history. Mithridates killed Cyrus, the younger brother of Artaxerxes II, in battle in 404 BC. Plutarch states that Artaxerxes was very pleased with Cyrus' death and gave Mithridates lavish gifts and asked him to keep everything a secret so that the king could claim that he had killed Cyrus. Mithridates got drunk at a feast and bragged about Cyrus' death by his own hand. When Artaxerxes heard this, he was so angry that he ordered Mithridates to be executed as follows. 2 boats were carved to fit each other, and in one, Mithridates was posed naked and smeared from head to toe with milk and honey. He was forced to drink some of it as well. Then the other boat was pinned to him until his hands, feet, and head were sticking out. In this state, it was left anchored in the lake for several days. The flying insects found him and began eating the milk and honey all over his body, biting and stinging him as they did so. The next day, the top boat was removed, he was again doused with milk and honey and forced to eat more, then left floating in the lake. He finally began to urinate and defecate on himself in the boat, attracting more insects, which then began to enter. It enters its body through its various openings, nests inside it, and lays eggs that hatch. Thus the vermin ate from his eyes and entered his sinuses. In this case, he died after 17 days of torment. 4. The Dune brothers, 1314. The love affair that made the 100 Years' War inevitable. Gautier and Philippe Aunay were knights of the court of Philip IV of France. In 1313, Philip's daughter, Queen Isabella of England, gave embroidered purses to her brothers Louis and Charles and their wives Blanche and Margaret. Later that year, she and King Edward II hosted a large banquet in London for their French guests. Isabella noticed that the purses she had given to Blanche and Marguerite were carried by the Dune brothers. Isabella suspected that her 2 sisters-in-law were having illicit affairs, and told her father the following year. The 2 brothers were placed under surveillance. Knights tended to come and go frequently to the Parisian guard tower Tour de Nesle built by Philip II. The whole incident became known as the Tour de Nesle affair. Philip eventually went public with the adultery and had both men and women arrested. Blanche and Margaret were found guilty, had their heads shaved, and were imprisoned for life. Gautier and Philippe of Aunay were tortured until they confessed their guilt and were then executed on charges of lèse-majesté, that is, insulting majesty. This was seen as an extremely humiliating form of treason and required the harshest punishment. The brothers were accordingly castrated and their reproductive organs thrown to dogs. They were then skinned alive, molten lead and sulfur poured over their exposed bodies, broken on the wheel, and finally beheaded. 3. Alcide King, 1705. Being sawed in half, the worst punishments in human history. A king who was a governor, Cade, during the reign of the Sultan of Morocco, Moulay Ismail bin Sharif. In 1705, one of the Sultan's sons, Moulay Muhammad, attempted a rebellion led by Malik and others. Once the rebellion was put down, Malik was considered the most responsible and deserved the maximum punishment. The Sultan's wife was angry that Malik had beheaded one of her cousins, Ali Bukhara. Thus, in September or October, Moulay Ismail asked his chief carpenter if his saws were capable of cutting a person in half, and the carpenter replied that they were. Then the carpenter was assigned the job of executioner. He wondered whether the millet should be deployed in half sagittal, along the spine, or transversely, across the waist. Ismail Samai answered, starting at the head. The carpenter packed 2 saws with cloth so that Malik would not know how he would be executed, lest he would try to escape, and Melik was taken to the public square where up to 4,000 relatives and friends had gathered. Melik, who had been quietly smoking his pipe, was stripped naked and tied face down to a board placed on a sawhorse. The executioners had intended to start at his head, but Bushra's sons said they should start between Melik's legs lest he die too quickly. Melik screamed horribly as the blade slowly cut him in half along his spine until it reached his navel. He was still conscious and begging for water when the executioners placed the blade on his head and slowly sawed him in two. 2. Jan van Leyden, Bernhard Krichting, and Bernhard Knipperdoling, 1536. The history of the mysterious hanging cages of this medieval church. These three men were leaders in the Münster Rebellion. They attempted to overthrow Catholic hegemony in favor of Anabaptist Protestantism in Germany. They drove the bishop-mayor Franz von Waldeck out of the city. He immediately assembled an army of mercenaries and imposed a siege. The Protestants led Jean Matisse until he was killed outside the city walls. The siege lasted more than a year, and most of the population starved to death as a result. On June 24, 1535, Waldeck's army finally broke through the walls and regained control. Knipperdoling and Krichting were immediately arrested. Jan was found hiding in the basement. On January 22, 1536, they were taken to a temporary platform in the market square, tied to an iron stake, and fitted with iron collars so they could not move. The iron tongs were then heated until they were very hot. They were held in the middle like scissors and shaped like modern spaghetti tentacles. Jean was stripped to the waist, and his flesh was torn apart, one hot bite at a time, for a full hour. Knipperdoling could not see him, but he heard him howl in pain as his flesh was torn to his bones. Knipperdoling attempted suicide by strangling himself with his iron collar. He was then tied up in a way that immobilized him. After an entire hour of suffering, his flesh was torn into large pieces, and Jean's tongue was completely torn from his throat. Then a red-hot dagger was plunged into his heart. Then it was Knipperdoling's turn for 1 hour, then Krichting's turn. Their bodies were locked in iron cages, hoisted to the top of the tower of St. Lambert's Cathedral, and left there to rot for 50 years as a warning. The cages are still hanging there today. 1. Balthasar Gerard, 1584. Balthasar Gerard was an example of this. Philip of Spain placed a bounty on the head of the Dutch Prince William. On July 10, 1584, after dinner at his house, William went downstairs, where Gerard suddenly emerged and fired one of his 2 wheel-lock pistols into William's chest. He collapsed and died instantly, and Gerard fled. But he tripped over some trash and was arrested. He did not deny his actions and was tried and convicted. The court ordered Gerard to be tortured for 3 days. The first time, he was hung with his hands tied behind him on a pole and was lifted and fell, dislocating his shoulders. Then they flogged him with a whip. The wounds were smeared with honey, and a goat came and licked it with its rough tongue, but it did not come near, so it rubbed his wounds with salt. The next day, he was hung from the pole again, with 300-pound weights tied to each of his big toes for 30 minutes. A shoe made of untreated leather was placed on his feet and placed over a fire, the heat of which shrank the shoe and crushed the bones in his feet. The next day they were robbed and his cooked meat was taken with them. The branding irons were then pressed into his armpits. His chest muscles were cut, the wounds were rubbed with salt, and pins were placed under all of his fingernails and toenails. He was then dressed in a shirt soaked in alcohol, and poured burning lard on him. On July 14, pincers were used to tear off his flesh. Then his right hand was burned with a red-hot iron. Then his abdomen was cut open, his intestines were removed, his genitals were cut off, and his arms and legs were cut off. His lips were seen trembling until his chest was split open, and his heart was ripped out and thrown in his face. If you liked the video, do not forget to subscribe and activate the bell to receive upcoming videos, and if you want more, leave us in the comments. See you.